Check one, check two, check three. Check one, check two, check three. Feedback is good for you and me.
Checking. May you talk as loud as you think you're going to talk?
This is as loud as I'm going to talk. That was just a talk.
Is that the other?
Yeah.
That one? That's not ours.
Shall we start? Are we good? All right, with apologies as we're running 4 minutes late. We must press on. I'm Justin London, and I'm chairing this session and also giving the first talk. How convenient. This is a session on aspects of musical rhythm, and I'm sharing some work that I'm doing with my colleagues Anna Danielsen and Christian Nijmoen at the University of Oslo. This is part of the Timing and Sound in Musical Microrhythm project funded by the Research Council of Norway. What we're going to be talking about are P centers or perceptual centers for musical sounds. When exactly do you hear the beat in a note, or where you would index its temporal location and time? It's been well studied in language and phonetics, but not nearly so much in music. And as Mike Schutz pointed out, where's Mike's here? All right, there you are. Sorry. Well, yes. Yes. Yeah. But occluded by Yayoi, so I can't. Yeah. That in the range of the literature where we study rhythm and timing, we've actually used a very few narrow range of sounds, mostly snare drum sounds, piano sounds. Well, Mike can give the talk. Yeah, beeps. Right. And our real goal here is to understand how ensemble coordination happens and how people combine their sounds together to get a sense of an attack or an alignment, or how they're subtly changed when jazz musicians are playing in the pocket or not. And that's, in fact, what Anna's work is from. So what's a P center? Okay, it is, as I said, the perceptual onset of a sound that recurs in time. It can be a speech sound, a musical sound, it can be any sound. And the thing to note is it's not the physical onset of the sound, but it's where you hear the sound occurs. The classic way in which different sounds are studied is you have a repeating cycle of sounds, and then you have some tasks that the participant manipulates some aspects of the cycle of sounds or the alignment until you get subjective equivalence of onset or subjective synchronization, or you tap along with them. And so this is an illustration which shows that you have the physical onsets and IOIs versus the P center, which are these dashed lines. So the question is, in any given sound, where could the P center of a sound be? There's the actual physical onset where the sound first begins. That's usually sub-threshold. We can't even hear it. So then there's the perceptual threshold. Or the perceptual onset. But that is not necessarily where you hear the P center of the sound. It's usually sometime after the perceptual onset and before the first, but not always, the first energy peak. So somewhere in here is where P centers have been, and there's been some work in trying to figure out ways of automatically extracting P centers at thresholding methods, or noticing where the attack slope curve changes or things like that. But it turns out it's a complicated question as to where all these events can be, where the P center can be in the sequence of events. But you notice that sounds have this temporal shape. And so the clue is, how do we connect the temporal shape to where we hear the P center? And traditionally, it's been, where's the point in time that is where the P center is in this essentially attack envelope of a sound. And our answer is you're not looking for a point in time. You're looking for the range in time where you would acceptably locate the P center. This gets, again, to Anna Danielson's work with synchronization and beats in funk and jazz drumming, which she had this notion of a beat bin. Beats are not points in times. They're kind of like regions of time, and it's a bin, and the beat is in there, and you can be shading it one way or another. So we are calling this P bins instead of from the beat bins. So yes, they definitely have an anchor or center of gravity, and you can find that in terms of some mean or average location. And so in these various methods where people would look at them, you would find like averaging where clicks were located or averaging where people would tap along. And the peak of the distribution is that there's the P center location. Our answer is it's not the peak of the distribution, it's the distribution. And so while they have a peak, and that's the mean, they have a width. And then we can look at the standard deviation about the mean to see we have very tight and well-defined P centers versus more wider ones. And they actually have a shape or bias. So you can look at skew and kurtosis, and you can find actually, those would be statistical ways of looking at it. But I've got pictures, so hang on. Okay. So previous studies have looked at the factors that give rise to P centers in musical sounds. We are not the first group that's been looking at that. And they found that a longer rise time, the slower attack, gives to a later location of the P center, and they noted wider, greater variability in the location, which we turn that into that's a wider beat bin or a wider P bin. So longer duration is also important. If the duration is very short, a beep or a tone click, there is no space for one to have any width for the P center. So we expect wider and flatter probability density distributions because that, in fact, is what the shape of the P bin is going to be. It's going to be a probability density to occur when you have longer rise times and longer durations. Those two factors are going to work together, and we want to see the nature of the interaction between those two factors. High sounds versus low sounds are going to make a difference, we think, but we're not sure what it is. We're agnostic. As it turned out, it was for good reason. And we expect that these three factors, rise time, duration, and high versus low center frequencies, are going to have a difference in combination. So some interaction among those factors. So we're going to report on two experiments which use two experimental methods. All involve these, you loop and repeat stimuli, and then you have some task which shows where the subjective onset occurs. One uses real musical stimuli from some music sample sets. The others, we came up with a matched set of artificial stimuli that was created from notch filtered noise. It used, the next slide will give you the details on that. And then we used two different response methods. And it turns out this was quite important because the task changes where the P center is and what it looks like. The classic method is the method of adjustment, where the participant is able to take two sounds and make them isochronous so that they sound perfectly evenly, or you align so they're one on top of the other. We used aligning a click track with random offset, and you manipulate it until they're synchronous. By the way, we piloted lots of different ways of doing this and found just aligning the click track was simplest. But I will point out, for many of the sounds, this is quite a difficult task. And the other was synchronization task, a tapping task. And what we actually did was to avoid latency problems, because here you really want to make sure there's no latency between your signal and your response. We split the signal, and we had people tapping with clave sticks, which gave us really nice. They got to practice with the clave sticks until they were, happy. And then they were able to get real clave audio synced with the stimulus audio, which worked very nicely. So here is a little summary of the sounds, and you can think of them as they're described here. Fast versus slow is the onset, short versus long is the duration, and low versus high is the center frequency of the sounds. So I'll start with the artificials. These were either 100 or 400 milliseconds long, 3 milliseconds or 50 millisecond rise time, and center frequencies of 100 or 700 hertz. And this is notch filtered noise. And then, as best as we could, we found sets to match these from the musical stimuli. And here they are. Here are the musical stimuli. And the notch noise, including the click. Thrilling. Just be glad you didn't have to do the experiment. Okay, all right. Oh, all right. Your presenter view doesn't work like my presenter view. I'm just saying. Okay, all right, now here we go. So we ran the experiment. Here's what we found out. I'm going straight to the results. Because we had some participants and they were nice and all those happy things, but let's get to the results. So these are the musical click alignment, the quasi-musical click alignment, the musical tapping, and the quasi-musical tapping. You'll notice the following patterns. Okay. There we go. This really doesn't work well. Well, I'll work without presenter tools, just like Christine this morning. So slow attacks, we have obviously late, and this is later. 0 here means perfectly aligned with the physical onset of the attack. All right, they're later, and the error bars, which are 1/2 standard deviation, shows you the variability here. So except for like long, low sounds, these were all uniform the same. And notice that we're getting very similar responses between the quasi-musical and the musical sounds. The long, low sounds are giving us the latest P-center locations and some of the widest distributions. Tapping, we get tells us a different story. And notice that with the short sounds, very short sounds, we actually have, for the musical sounds, a little negative mean asynchrony. We actually had a click-to-click alignment test and tap along with the click, where we got the classic 20 millisecond tap early negative mean asynchrony behavior. There are some more pronounced differences between the quasi-musical tapping and the quasi-musical clicking in terms of the differences between the stimulus categories came out more clearly, we think mostly because we control the differences amongst the stimulus categories more precisely than in the other real musical experiments. So this is just another way of looking at all the data in terms of P-center locations. So the blue and the red are the real musical data, and the yellow and the purple are the quasi-musical stimuli. And the big takeaway here is the notch filtered noise gave rise to pretty much the same kinds of responses as the music. So those features that we had isolated in the quasi-musical stimuli seem to be the right ones in terms of that. This tells a story about different modes of response. This is the standard deviation. And the tapping are the red and the purple, and you notice it's flat. Because once you start tapping, your standard deviation, your variability is mostly constrained by the motor behavior, not by responding to the stimulus. It gets highly damped. So you don't get nice information in terms of variability about the mean, because now your tapping behavior has sort of swamped that. So let's look now at the click alignment, and I'll finish up with some pictures. These are the beat bin shapes from the first experiment with the real musical stimuli. And if we have clicks and kick drums and snare drums, there doesn't seem to be too much going on, and it looks like you've got a location and a little bit of noise about it. But once we start looking at some of these other kinds of sounds, we notice the shapes get more interesting. And it turns out there's, especially as they get longer, and with slower attacks, we have changes in like secondary peaks, where there's definitely a secondary location where beat bins can happen. And you'll note that the similarities here, this is slow, short, and this is fast, long, and yet these distributions are very, very similar versus slow, short, and slow, long. They're very different. So the variables do not line up the way you would think. Things are even messier with the artificial data. And these are even simpler stimuli, but the responses are much more complicated, possibly because they're unfamiliar, but also because it's just the nature of the response. They were harder to coordinate with, especially like this slow, long, low. We don't know what the hell's going on here. Okay, but it's an interesting question what properly synchronized means for some of these sounds, right? Okay, I am being told to stop now. So we're going to get into summary and conclusions. I will rush this because we started late. The slow attack and long duration, as was shown in previous work, does lead to a later P-center. Effect of duration lessens with a fast rise time. So rise time explains most of the variance. Frequency didn't have much effect and only with the musical sounds. And maybe because they were musical sounds with richer spectral info. And you saw how we had wider and more varied beat bin shapes with the slow attack and long duration. The other big idea is that different methods yield different results. So we're the first study that has combined real and artificial sounds and several different modes of participant response. The taps indicate earlier P-centers, not just with clicks, but across about half the stimuli. So the negative mean asynchrony may be there. You just don't notice it because it's negative mean asynchrony relative to the P-center, not to the physical onset. Taps have constant variability. The click alignment task has variable variability, which for us is a feature, not a bug. And we're going to do more things with different sounds, different tasks, wider frequency ranges, and ultimately we want to look at participant background and see how drummers with drum sounds, jazz musicians with jazz bass sounds, and Hardanger fiddle players, yes, you can find those in Norway, with Hardanger fiddle sounds. Thank you very much for your attention. All right, and now perhaps we can have some questions, which will start one here. Yes, Professor White.
Hi.
Hi.
So I wonder if you would speculate a little bit on what you mean by a P-center if there is this other little bump in your data, because like when I think about the concept of a P-center, I'm thinking about like a window in which something could happen. But if you've got this other little bump, it's like a choice.
Yeah.
Right. Most people would do something here, but then there's this other little option, which isn't quite a window, you know.
Well, if we would say it's the shape of the beat bin, and when you have and we have a bimodal beat bin, so this is a sound that affords like two places where one could locate sounds. So we'd like to come up with extreme versions of those sounds, and then see if we can get people to, oh yes, some went here and some went there, and show that they were bistable. And also in terms of combinations with other sounds. Ultimately, we want to start using these sounds in combinations and not aligning with a click track, but aligning with the different sounds and seeing how that behavior would show how those sounds work. But yeah, it's counterintuitive. Do we have a question from afar? We've lost Australia. Okay. In the
kind of following along the last question, were people pretty consistent? Like, so some people had tapped early and some people consistently tapped late, or was it just everybody was had more distribution, distributed time?
Okay. Most of the people were fairly consistent and tappers. Now, for the full story about the participants, I told you the click alignment task was hard. We started out with, I'm going to say about 30 participants because I can't see my notes. We had to throw out 6 of them because they really couldn't consistently do the click alignment task. And we threw out their tapping data as well. Their tapping data wasn't bad, right? So there was a disjunct. And there's an interesting thing. Can't do the click alignment, have no trouble really doing the tapping. They tap, no one was particularly late or early.
But the second bump, like the shapes were weird. What explains that secondary?
Right. So we didn't have, everybody had like 3 trials per stimulus. So we didn't have 10 trials per stimulus with participant, which is what we would have needed to do. So that was aggregated across all that. So I can't answer the direct question, and I don't think I could, even if I were to look at our data again, because I don't have enough data per participant to show how consistent they were. Part of that's also an artifact of we randomized whether the click came early or late from the physical onset, and they had to manipulate, and some people would take a minute going back and forth until they thought they'd found the alignment.
You only had one data point with the click alignment task, whereas tapping it.
Right, tapping goes much faster because you do an iterated trial, and once you've got a bunch of taps, you pretty much know where everybody thinks things should be.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. Have you ever tried to compare your human participants' performance to a performance by an algorithm, like created for speech, for example, that takes into account all of those parameters that you manipulated in your experiment?
No, but I want to give Ed Large our stimuli and see what his oscillator model does with it. That's basically one of the things on the to-do list. So that's not our thing, but we have friends who will help us with that. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely a good suggestion. Yeah.
I was wondering, great talk. I was wondering if there was any perception measure that were taken and compared with the latency of the response, because we know people will vary in the latency of perceiving onset of sound.
What do you mean a perception?
Example with frequency following response, people will vary a lot in when they perceive a sound, and the time it takes them can vary between 7 milliseconds, whereas to 20 milliseconds with people with disability or with people with musical training.
Right. So we didn't actually collect any just perception. How reaction time data in terms of how quickly do you perceive the sound.
So I was wondering if that could influence that variability that we see in the production task.
Yeah, I would have thought it might have more to do with the alignment task more so than the production. But that's a very good point. And the ding dong means it's time to move on to our next speaker. Thank you for your attention.
talk a little.
Check, check. I'll probably talk louder. Is that good?
Yeah.
All right. So previous research has studied the various factors that might affect performers' tempo choices, focusing on the extent to which there's a so-called right tempo for certain pieces, which would result in a narrow range of tempo choices between performers, or if performers instead choose a wide range of tempos, suggesting that the piece could sound right under a variety of different interpretations. Michael Schutz presented one such study at ICMPC 2 years ago in 2016, where he focused on investigating tempo choices in performances of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. The results of that study indicate a negative correlation between rhythmic variability and tempo variability. So as rhythmic variability increased, there was less tempo variability between performers. Likewise, pieces that have low rhythmic variability, for instance, if they are completely isochronous, had a wider range of tempo choices. So my aim with this study is to test that hypothesis for another large set of Bach instrumental pieces, the 6 sonatas and partitas for unaccompanied violin. These pieces are amongst the most important in the violin repertoire and have been recorded by dozens of expert violinists on both period and modern instruments. They occupy a similar place in Bach's repertoire as the Well-Tempered Clavier and demonstrate a similar variety of rhythmic features. So amongst the 32 total movements in this collection are Baroque dances, variation forms, fugues, moto perpetuo pieces, and pieces that are seemingly improvisatory in feel. So the materials for the study include 40 expert performances of all 32 movements from these Bach violin pieces. The performances are available on commercial recordings, ranging from 1934 to 2017, and demonstrating a variety of different performance practice styles. Of the 40 recordings, 12 of the violinists are playing on period instruments in a historically informed style, and those violinists are indicated with an asterisk on this table, as well as on some of the slides I'll show you later. In terms of the scores, Bach didn't indicate any specific tempo instructions other than those that were associated with the interpretation of certain time signatures in the 18th century, or with generic tempo words like andante or presto, or with the characteristics of certain Baroque dances. I calculated rhythmic variability using the Normalized Pairwise Variability Index, or NPVI. This equation measures the degree of durational contrast between successive elements in a sequence. For instance, a low NPVI score reflects a relative lack of durational contrast, with 0 indicating a completely isochronous sequence. Although all violinists use rubato to deviate from strict metronomical timing, this study focuses on comparing their overall global tempo choice. So the nominal or the average tempo of each piece was determined by identifying the onset of the first note and the last note and taking that total length and dividing it by the total number of measures in the piece in order to get that sense of average tempo across the piece relative to its length in both the score and the performance. That calculation was then used to determine that average tempo for different metric levels of the piece or different notated durations within the score. In order to make comparisons between tempo choices across all 32 of these movements, the degree of tempo variability between the 40 performances of each movement will be expressed as the coefficient of variation. So this table shows the NPVI score for each of the 32 violin movements, ordered from the least to the most rhythmically variable. The bars are colored to highlight 4 main groups of NPVI scores, ranging from the 9 isochronous or almost completely isochronous movements, to, those are in orange, to the 3 movements with the greatest rhythmic variability, shown in green at the bottom. Based on the results of the Well-Tempered Clavier study, we might expect the opposite shape for tempo variability, with the least rhythmically variable movements having the greatest tempo variability between performers and vice versa. However, the results of this study indicate that this is not always the case for this collection of violin pieces. Although some of the isochronous movements have high tempo variability as predicted, others have amongst the lowest, for instance, the G minor presto, which is towards the top of the list. And the 3 pieces with the highest NPVI scores, those green bars, also have high tempo variability rather than the predicted narrow range of tempo choices. So depicted another way, the scatter plot shows the correlation between the NPVI score and the coefficient of variation for each movement. Rather than showing that hypothesized negative correlation, these two variables have a correlation of 0.46. In particular, notice the 9 isochronous movements on the left side of the graph. Their tempo variability spans almost the entire range of all 32 movements, from about 8 to 18%. And on the other side are the 3 movements with the highest NPVI scores, which also have a larger amount of tempo variability between performers. So these results suggest that tempo choices for this collection of pieces cannot be entirely explained by rhythmic variability. So I added an analysis of metric structure in order to further study the relationship between different structural features of the piece and performer tempo choices. So just a quick summary, the metric hierarchy of any piece is created by the number of present pulse streams, their mathematical relationship to each other, and then those relationships affect the single pulse or maybe the multiple pulses that could be perceived as the beat, as well as our overall perception of tempo. Based on numerous previous studies and summarized by London, the range of perceivable beats is 30 to 300 beats per minute, and within that, the range of maximal pulse salience, 85 to 100, reflects the beats that are most preferred, most comfortable, or maybe most perceptually salient. So I'm going to highlight a few of the specific movements from this collection to show how aspects of metric structure and beat perception might combine with rhythmic variability to offer additional explanations for the degree of tempo agreement or lack of tempo agreement between certain movements. So we're going to start with these 9 isochronous movements, and on this graph they're ordered from the least to the greatest tempo variability, which is the coefficient of variation is indicated with those black triangles. So each bar in the graph represents the mean nominal tempo for all 40 performances at different metric levels. For the sake of consistency, I will always label each metric level according to the notated time signature. So for instance, if Bach notated the piece in 2/2, I'll call the half note the beat, regardless of whether or not that's actually going to be the perceived beat of the piece. For each of these pieces, the bar on the far right represents the isochronous surface rhythms. So as in the well-tempered clavier study, the lack of rhythmic variability sometimes led to a wide variety of tempo choices, as is the case for those 3 movements on the far right of the graph, which all happen to come from the B minor partita. But other movements were performed with a narrower range of tempos. And all of those movements, the isochronous surface rhythms, are well above that 300 beats per minute and are outside the range of beat perception. Some are even in a 500 or 600 range. In contrast, there's more tempo variability in movements whose surface rhythms are not as fast, who are less than that 300 beats per minute. And this relationship is reflected by a correlation of negative 0.77 between the tempo of the isochronous surface and the degree of tempo variability as indicated by the coefficient of variation. So we'll look in more detail at the specific characteristics of the 2 movements that are at the ends of this tempo variability range, the C major allegro assai and the B minor allemande double. So in this C major allegro, there's both low rhythmic variability and low tempo variability. With the exception of a couple of those 8th notes at the very beginning of the piece, this movement has entirely repeated 16th notes. So the box and whisker plots display the median, interquartile range, min and max of the nominal tempos for all 40 performances, and the center dot displays the mean. So these ranges are shown for the tempo of the notated beat, which in this case is a quarter note, the division, 8th note, and the subdivision, 16th note. Based on these ranges, there's likely one perceived beat for this piece, which matches the notated quarter note and is fairly fast at 125 beats per minute for the median. So if we zoom in on just that quarter note level, I'm going to play you 3 different performances, the slowest to the median and the fastest. And notice for this piece, that entire range only spans about 25 beats per minute, which is fairly small at this tempo. In all 3 performances, we will likely attend to the beat that matches that notated quarter note. So here's our slowest of the 40 performances. Right, and then the median performance, which was Rachel. Since we're in triple meter, the grouping level, or the measure, would be 3 times as slow as that quarter note beat, with a mean around 42 beats per minute and a range of 34 to 48. At the fastest tempo, it might be possible to perceive that beat and experience hypermeter. So we'll listen to Ibragimova, who's our fastest of the 40, to see if you still attend to the written quarter note or instead you're thinking of the dotted half, kind of the grouping level. So So pieces that fall into this range of tempo variability suggest that there's a narrower range of tempo choices when there's only one likely perceived beat, when that beat corresponds with the notated beat, and when the fastest metric level in the hierarchy, in this case the isochronous 16th notes, is outside the range of beat perception. So to contrast that, the B minor Allemand double, also isochronous, but rather than exhibiting tempo agreement among performers, it has the second highest amount of tempo variability of all 32 movements. So in looking at the range of tempos at different metric levels in this piece, we see that there might be two possible perceived beats. The notated quarter note at a median of about 70 beats per minute, which is actually the beat division relative to the time signature of 2/2, and the notated eighth at a median around 140 beats per minute, which is the subdivision. That notated eighth note has a range of almost 100 beats per minute, around a median of 140, compared to the previously described allegro, which has a range of only 25 beats per minute, around a mean of 125. Even the next subdivision level, the notated 16th note and the isochronous surface, is not that fast, with a median of 280 beats per minute, that still falls within that range of possible beat perception. So again, I'll zoom into these two possible likely beats, the notated quarter or division and the notated eighth note or subdivision. At the slowest tempo, listeners might choose the eighth note metric level at 84 beats per minute, since it falls close to that optimal range of maximal pulse salience. So as you listen to Szigeti's performance, decide if your attention is drawn to groups of two 16th notes, thus representing that eighth note beat, which is reinforced by Bach's slurs. So here's that slowest performance. So to go to the other extreme, at the fastest tempo, this is Shlomo Mintz, we might opt for the quarter note level instead, which is at 90 beats per minute. Again, that's the metric level that falls closest to that range of maximal pulse salience. So in this case, listen and see if you're instead kind of drawn towards groups of 4 16th notes combining to create that quarter note beat. And comparing those tempo extremes, we see that Mintz's quarter note at 90 is faster than Szigeti's eighth note at 84. This suggests that these performers might have been attending to different metric levels when they chose their tempo, or maybe different aspects of the melodic structure or their harmonic structure. And if that's the case, that might lead to a wider variety of tempo choices between performers. So here's the median tempo, and you can see if either of these possible beats is what you're To contrast that Allemand double with the other movement that exhibited the widest range of tempo choices, and this is the Adagio from the C major sonata. Instead of being monophonic and isochronous, this Adagio has a repeated dotted 8 16th note rhythmic pattern that persists throughout the entire piece. It's also full of multiple stops instead of being completely monophonic. So what do these seemingly different pieces have in common that would prompt our 40 performers to have a similarly wide range of tempo choices? Both of these pieces have two metric levels that are in similar tempo ranges, and all of those possible perceived beats correspond with the notated beat division or subdivision rather than the beat itself as reflected by the time signature. They also lack any extremely fast metric levels at the fastest part of the metric hierarchy. So again, to show the possible perceived beats for the Adagio, and I've added the range for the notated quarter note relative to the 3/4 time signature. So at the slowest tempo, we might choose the eighth note at 48 beats per minute, which is at the slow end of the range of beat perception. But the written quarter note is perhaps too slow at 24. And although the 16th note is within the range of maximal pulse salience at about 95, it's an unlikely choice of beat due to its placement within that repeated melodic and rhythmic figure. So here is Buswell's slowest performance. Slow performance. All right, so at the fastest tempo, Gil Shaham, which is actually an outlier, we might still choose that eighth note as the beat. This time it's at 100 beats per minute, but we might also select the quarter note at 50. It is slow, but it's in a perceivable range and draws attention to that melodic content in the repeated rhythmic figure. Also notice that similar to the previous piece, we have a performer, Shaham, whose quarter note at 50 is faster than Buswell's eighth note at 48. So again, suggesting that performers might be attending to different aspects of musical structure when choosing their tempo and producing more variability between performers. So here's Shaham's fastest performance. Again, I'll give you it's like the Goldilocks syndrome. We'll go with the middle now. So here's our median performance. So like the Aleman double, this greater tempo variability could be caused by the existence of two possible beats, a likely beat that doesn't match the notated beat, and a fastest metric level that is within the range of beat perception. So some final comparisons between high and low tempo variability centers around the 4 movements within this collection that are notated in compound duple meter. Although all 4 have the same notated metric structure, they have different ranges of tempo agreement and different metric levels as the likely perceived beat. The 2 jigs are overall fast and have low tempo variability, with 1 possible perceived beat that matches the notated beat, and those are the striped blue bars. And all of these are at duple metric level, that beat, a median around 75 beats per minute. The Siciliana and the Laureat overall slow pieces have greater rhythmic variability as well as higher tempo variability. These pieces also have a possible beat around 75 beats per minute, but that beat now matches the notated beat division, the striped green bars, and is at the triple metric level. So we'll look in detail at one example of each of these pairs, the D minor jig and the G minor Siciliana. So again, notate the similar metric structure, both written in 12/8 time, but the jig is mostly isochronous after the first 2 measures and is monophonic. Again, low rhythmic variability, low tempo variability. Whoops, I'm sorry. And the Siciliana is polyphonic and has higher rhythmic variability and higher tempo variability. So although the likely beat for both movements falls within a similar range, again around a median of 75, that beat corresponds with the notated dotted quarter note in the jig and with the notated division in the Siciliana. For the jig, we're unlikely to choose anything other than the dotted quarter note as the beat, and given that beat perception, we'll experience that lilting character of compound meter. So in this case, we'll just listen to the fastest of the performances just for the sake of time. For the Siciliana, the 8th note is very slow in high-fastest performances, but it's unlikely we'll shift to the 16th because it's the fastest level of the metric hierarchy. And it's also unlikely we'll do the written dotted quarter note since it's 3 times as slow. So if we attend to that 8th note, we actually perceive simple triple meter rather than the written compound meter. So here's Grumio plays that 8th note at 100 beats per minute, which makes it possible to hear the notated dotted quarter as the beat and perceive compound meter, or we could stick with that faster 8th note and perceive simple triple. So here's So as before, it's possible these performers are attending to different levels of the metric hierarchy to choose their tempo, or different aspects of melodic and harmonic structure. And those not only produce greater tempo variability between performers, but also can shift our attention between simple and compound meter. So just to summarize, these results do not completely replicate those of the well-tempered clavier study. Many of the isochronous violin movements were played with a narrow tempo range, and pieces with the highest NPVR had a wider or less tempo agreement. However, they do support this hypothesis that tempo choices can be affected by structural features of the piece. So in this case, in terms of metric structure, results suggest that tempo variability could be affected by the rate of the isochronous sequence, the location of the beat relative to the surrounding metric levels and the other aspects of melodic or harmonic structure, the likelihood of a single perceived beat or multiple possibilities, and the relationship between the notated beat and our choice of perceived beat. So further research, I'm hoping to do some perceptual studies where participants can listen to some of these recordings, indicate their choice of beats and maybe also their perceived tempo. Might find out if a performer chooses a certain tempo, does that constrain the choices of beats that the listener might feel. Also hoping to look at the relationship between rhythmic variability and timing variability or rubato rather than just overall global tempo. So, thank you.
Questions for Stacy?
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks.
Nick Cook has done a lot of work on performance practice for the 20th century, and he's talked about how pieces become less variable throughout the 20th century and also more alike. And he says that one of those breaks is like the war, and I see that you had one piece that was from pre-war and everything else was post-war.
Right.
So did you find any relationship between variability between performances and date of recording or anything like that?
I looked at that a little bit. So far, I don't see an exact trend. There's also some research showing that performances get faster over time, which is not necessarily what I found either. I did find some tendencies by performer. And so there are some performers who always tended to choose the faster tempos versus the slower ones. But there's not a lot of recordings pre-war. We have Yehudi Menuhin's, and so we just need more to make that sort of comparison.
We have a remote question.
Okay.
I'll kind of follow up on Dan's question. You notated the historical instruments and connecting kind of with Justin's talk and assuming that those instruments are actually going to have larger P-bins. Was there a tendency there toward slower tempi overall?
Not overall. Nope. Again, if I had more time, I could show you kind of the data by performer for each, and didn't really find that the players of Baroque instruments with the gut strings were necessarily the slowest or the fastest. Some tendency that they hovered in the middle range, but I don't think it's as consistent. So, yeah.
I'm just gonna be a quick follow up for the.
Yeah.
Did you look at age of performer and kind of and how like
yeah. I haven't yet in detail, but I definitely think that's also a factor. Yeah, for sure.
Not at all. So, yeah, those of us who know and play these pieces, which if you're a guitarist you can do, some of them are in groups. They're essentially variation sets, like the B minor.
The whole B minor
is basically the same thing over again.
That's right.
Have you broken it out into the ones that essentially are variation sets versus the non-variation sets? Because I would think you'd get carryover because you literally do the same things with your fingers on the instrument even though you're playing all the different dances. So there are tempo differences, but it might squeeze it together. So have you looked at the data that way?
Not in great detail yet, but there's definitely some consistencies in the B minor partita, which has 4 of the dance forms, each followed by a variation movement on that. And in one of the graphs, you might have seen that there was a collection of those B minor pieces that all fell in a similar range of tempo variability. So I think it's there, but I need to,
as well.
right. Yeah, so I think it's there. I just need to look at it in more detail.
Probably our last question.
Yeah, no pressure. Yeah.
3 minutes.
Okay. Well, deeply disappointed that it didn't
kind of me too.
produce the brilliant former study. No, I think this is fascinating. I love this idea of looking at the interpretation and how it relates to different things. Before I did the first 8 measures, not for any real reason, because it related to the previous studies that we've done. I don't know if it would turn out any differently with that.
Yeah, I can do that for sure.
I'd be fascinated. I don't have any reason to believe it would turn out differently. Before, we had just lined up the ones that had the most variability to least variability, and the isochronicity just sort of popped out, and I never looked at other stuff beyond that. So it might well be like each of them play a component. They could be pulled apart through. We're doing some commonality analysis with something else that picks apart different amounts of variance. So I think this is very cool stuff.
Let's work together and find
yeah,
out.
Yeah. No, so I love this idea.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Check, check. Oh God, I hate microphones. Okay. I have a teacher voice. I don't need a microphone.
Just check really quick your audio settings so your examples will play.
Let's see.
Maybe just before playing those.
Yep.
Still good?
Okay.
So I will and just cue me when you'd like me to.
Yes.
Switch over.
You get to stand here for a minute. 3 minutes. We have 3 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. There's an audio example that doesn't come through.
presentation, Lee Van Handel will be telling us about relations between melodic characteristics and tempo determination. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you. This actually dovetails really well on Stacy's work that we just saw. So one of the things that she was trying to explain was why her results didn't quite match up, and she conjectured that maybe certain melodic characteristics might have something to do with it. That's what we're looking at. So this is actually a perfect dovetail with your study. So the goal of this presentation is to provide a quick survey of prior research on tempo, discuss musical characteristics that may influence tempo, introduce what I'm calling tempo determination, and then present and discuss the results of an experiment using a new methodology for studying tempo determination. So research on tempo, and this is a super brief, broad survey of the prior research, has focused on concepts of preferred tempo, tempo memory, and tempo discrimination. So work in preferred tempo includes studying the limits of what may be considered a reasonable tempo. It includes spontaneous motor tempo and how it may vary with age, and the concept of individual preferred tempo and how that relates to physical and psychological limitations. It's also included some recent work on optimal tempo, or participants essentially selecting the right or correct tempo from provided options. Research in tempo memory focuses on whether we have memory for tempo in the same way that there's memory for pitch. So studies have found that remembered or imagined tempos for familiar songs are closely correlated, and that performance tempos are also tend to be stable across time. We also have a strong memory for the tempo of familiar music across genres. And work on tempo discrimination includes the ability to detect changes or differences in tempo and the thresholds at which such discrimination is possible. Tempo discrimination has been shown in both infants and adults, and there's conflicting evidence about whether tempo increases or decreases are more easily identifiable. So there are musical characteristics that contribute to the perception, memory, and discrimination of tempo. These characteristics include melodic and sonic cues, rhythmic cues, and harmonic cues, and may include others. As examples of melodic and sonic characteristics, music using higher pitches and brighter timbres have been shown to be perceived faster than comparison melodies. Melodies with more ornamentation are perceived to be faster than comparison melodies with less ornamentation. And melodies with more contour changes are perceived to be slower than melodies with fewer contour changes in a paired comparison task. For rhythmic cues, there's been investigations of the relationship between performed tempo and rhythmic characteristics, as we just saw, including attack rate, rhythmic complexity, syncopation, and hypermetrical levels and tempo. And harmonic characteristics also have an effect on tempo perception. The speed at which harmonies change, the specific harmonic progressions being used, the amount of repetition in harmonic structure have all been shown to have an effect on tempo perception. Okay, so what do I mean by tempo determination? What I'm calling tempo determination is the real-time act of, or process of determining what an appropriate tempo for an unfamiliar piece of music is, based on musical characteristics that act as cues for tempo. So the easiest way to think of this task is to imagine that you are asked to perform an unfamiliar piece of music with no tempo indication. You're asked to determine the tempo of this piece of music. So how do you make that determination? Chances are you're going to rely on musical characteristics of the piece, but which? The characteristics that you use may be the same ones that we just talked about as having a role in other tempo tasks. So they may be melodic, they may be rhythmic, they may be harmonic. Some combination thereof is what's going to lead you to determining the appropriate tempo for this unfamiliar piece. So my big picture research question is, what musical characteristics do you use to assist with this task? And is it possible to create a model for what the most important musical characteristics are that contribute to this determination task? My immediate question in the experiment I'm presenting today is, what melodic characteristics specifically act as cues to assist with tempo determination? So there's been a few studies recently doing similar types of work, but not with the same methodology that we're using. Quinn and Watt presented non-musician participants with a melody at a range of tempi and asked them to identify whether the tempo felt too fast or too slow. So there were set tempos, and they were just asked to identify whether it felt too fast or too slow to them. They also asked highly trained musicians to perform the melodies and found a strong correlation between the perceived optimal tempo of the non-musicians for the discrimination task and the performed tempos of the musicians, who were not given any guidance but had to determine that tempo. Jakubowski et al. Asked subjects to complete a musical imagery task both before and after completing an aerobic exercise activity. They found an effect of exercise-based arousal on both perceived and imagined tempos, so our determination can change based on physiological aspects as well. And Tamir Ostrover and Aitan did a study that used a similar but slightly different task to ours. They used some very simple melodic stimuli, asking participants to choose the most appropriate tempo for the stimuli. They found that register, contour, and, as they say, possibly interval size had significant effects on tempo. Okay, so what are we doing? We had 117 participants drawn from the subject pool at Michigan State. In general, they were non-musicians. They had an average of about 3 years of formal music training and a little over 1 year of music theory instruction. In addition to our tempo determination task, we also had them complete a battery of tapping tests, including a spontaneous motor test. We had them tap the fastest or slowest tap that they could imagine. Plus, we had them complete the Goldsmith's MSI index. For 58 of our subjects, all we collected was the final tempo that they determined for each melody, and I'll explain the methodology in just a second. For 59 of them, we collected continuous data, so every change they made to a tempo in real time, we collected that data. So from the participants' perspective, the task was exactly the same, so where it's possible, we've actually collapsed the data over these two populations. And I'll talk about the continuous data in a second. Okay, so for the tempo determination task, subjects heard a melody on a continuous loop and they manipulated the tempo of the melody in real time via an Arduino spin wheel controller. That's a picture of the spin wheel controller. If you can't really see it that well, it's because it is black and there are no markings on it whatsoever, and that's by design. The spin wheel itself doesn't provide any physical cues. There's no markings on the box or on the wheel. The wheel itself spins freely. And the reason I didn't bring the wheel with me, because I figured it was probably a bad idea to bring a black unmarked box onto a plane. But I can still demonstrate the experiment for you. So subjects used the spin wheel controller to speed up or slow down the tempo of the melody until they determined the correct tempo for that particular melody. At that point, they used the computer keyboard or mouse to indicate that they'd made their determination, and then they moved to the next melody. So in other words, they had complete control over the tempo of a stimuli. They were able to speed it up, slow it down in real time until they determined the correct tempo. The real-time tempo manipulation uses Miller-Puckett's phase vocoder, which is written in the pure data environment. This allows for manipulation, a high-quality manipulation of the stimuli. You don't get artifacts until you're either going very, very fast or very, very slow. The PD module interfaces with a custom experimental environment that presents stimuli and tracks the subject responses. Melodies are presented in random order. There's randomized jitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The subject has to spin the wheel to begin each melody. That adds another degree of randomness to the starting tempo of each melody. Okay, so we used modified versions of actual melodies for our stimuli. These melodies were drawn primarily from Haydn's trios for baritone, viola, and cello. The baritone is a bowed string instrument with sympathetic vibrating strings that was popular in Europe until the end of the 18th century. Haydn wrote 175 works for this instrument for his patron, Prince Esterhazy, who was an amateur baritonist. We selected these pieces as melodic source material because of their quality and their abundance, yet relative obscurity. They're well-regarded pieces exhibiting Haydn's typical compositional mastery, but they're hardly known even by music scholars. So we chose melodic fragments of varying lengths, keys, and ranges. We eliminated the rhythm so that the melodies were isochronous. We synthesized them using a grand piano timbre from the East West Sound Library. All the notes were at the same amplitude to avoid metric cues, were recorded at 100 beats per minute, et cetera, et cetera. So we coded each melody for a variety of musical characteristics, including the number of contour changes, the number and size of skips and leaps, the overall range of the melody, the number of simultaneous skips and leaps and contour changes, overall average interval size, average size, there's a list, okay. Ultimately, we chose 31 melodies exhibiting a wide range of musical characteristics, and this is what some of the stimuli sounded like. Okay, so everyone is going to see a blank screen for just a second. I'm going to load the experiment so that you can actually hear how it happens. As I said, I don't have the spin wheel, but I can control it using the keyboard. And we're going to have to get creative with the sound and hold the microphone up to the computer. Can you kind of hear it? So I can make it go faster. Or I can slow it down. Good enough. Okay. Okay. All right, coming back to our screen. There we go. Okay. So what we found was we found a significant correlation for pitch range and the average size of the skips and leaps. So the larger the overall range and the larger the average skip and leap size, the slower people determine the melodies should go. In addition, we found a strong correlation for the number of contour changes in a melody as well as the number of non-unison intervals. So this just measures the number of pitch changes. We left out repeated notes and just counted the number of pitch changes. Again, an increase in contour changes or the number of non-unison intervals correlates with slower tempos. The more skips and leaps, the more contour changes, the more people wanted things to slow down. They made them go at a slower tempo. Where we didn't find any result was any correlation with key or mode, or any indicated tempo marking from the original piece, or any correlation with any of the tapping tests that the participants completed. So there was no relation to spontaneous motor tempo, no relation to fastest, slowest tapping test, anything like that. So as I mentioned, for 59 of our subjects, we collected continuous data for each response. So what you're seeing now is 3 examples of collected responses from 3 different participants. The colored lines each indicate a different stimuli, and the black line is the average response for each participant. On these graphs, motion downward indicates an increase in tempo, because these are indicated in IOI. We noticed that there were a variety of strategies employed by participants. Some would alternate between slower and faster tempos until they found the right tempo. They would sort of zero in on it. Others would slowly increase or decrease the tempo. Others just did random stuff. One of the things we noticed, though, is that we looked at how many beats subjects listened to each melody, because the melody just repeated on a loop endlessly until they determined the tempo. We wanted to see if some melodies took subjects more time to determine that appropriate tempo. What we found was a negative correlation between melodic characteristics and the length of time listened. In other words, participants tended to arrive at a final determined tempo more quickly when there were more melodic changes in a melody. This indicates that if a melody doesn't contain a lot of information in the form of contour changes or large intervals, participants found it harder to find that correct tempo and listened longer than if they heard a lot of melodic activity and were able to zero in the approximately correct range more quickly. In other words, melodic events like contour changes and larger intervals provide strong and consistent cues that enable participants to make these tempo decisions more quickly. A stepwise linear regression found that contour change accounts for 24% of the variance in tempo. The tempo for melodies with more contour changes tended to be slower than melodies with fewer. Again, this indicates that the number of contour changes is the primary predictive factor in the tempo subjects determined to be appropriate. None of the other variables added any additional explanatory power. So what we found then is that melodic characteristics can, on their own, influence active tempo determination. It appears that this follows earlier findings from Boltz, an article she wrote in 1998, where she also found that contour change was a significant predictor of perceived tempo. But our task is different than Boltz's. Hers was a discrimination, or it was a discrimination task, forced choice task. The relationship between the two studies isn't as clear as we would hope, since in Boltz's perceived tempo task, her participants perceived melodies with more contour changes as going slower than melodies with fewer contour changes. There's two potential hypotheses about how our data relates to hers. One is that all participants may be attempting to set each melody to one particular preferred tempo. If that's the case, then our subjects may have actually perceived the melodies with more contour changes as going faster than their preferred tempo and may have slowed them down in response. But since we didn't find any correlation with preferred or spontaneous tempo, it doesn't seem like that's likely. So it may just be that melodic features actually provide participants with the specific information about how fast or slow a piece of music should go. In other words, there's a potential mismatch between the perception of tempo and the tempo you perceive something should go at. So we're obviously in the process of studying the continuous data. We're planning to study whether participants who use different strategies overall are relying on different melodic cues. We're planning to run a study similar to Boltz's using our stimuli to see if we can clarify that relationship between tempo perception and tempo determination. And as this is part of a larger project, we plan to begin investigating and testing the effect of rhythmic and harmonic characteristics on tempo determination, and work towards the goal of building an overall model for what musical characteristics influence tempo determination. Contour change only accounts for 24% of the variance, so there are obviously other factors that we need to investigate. I'm actually done.
Thank you very much. Can you just remind us the range of the final tempo? I didn't see it.
I didn't talk about it.
Okay.
I was scared I was going to run long, so I cut a lot out. So please ask questions. So participants in general tended to speed up the melodies from where they were initially presented. And so they were presented at 100 beats per minute with a 6% random jitter. Mm-hmm. And then the participants having to spin the wheel to start it added an additional amount of randomness to the starting tempo. The final tempo for many of the melody, well, for almost all of them, ended up being faster, and it sort of ranged from about 120 to about 150.
So this is the usual music tempo.
Yeah.
No
Yeah, there wasn't anything surprising in the tempos that they chose, but they did select slower tempos for the melodies that had more melodic characteristics like contour changes, like large skips and leaps.
Okay, can I have a quick one more? A quick one. Is it possible that you have a motoric memory? Because I saw that people tend to, in the strategies, they go up and down with your dial thing. Is it possible that they, just do that or not?
I mean, it's possible. You can take the spin wheel and just, go but that wasn't really a strategy that we saw. What we saw was that the people who were alternating between faster and slower were sort of, I'm going to have to draw in the air and I'm going to try to draw it backwards. They would sort of go, okay, I'm going to go slower, I'm going to go faster, I'm going to go a little less slow, I'm going to go a little less fast. And they sort of zeroed in on what they thought it would be. There were a few people who were just like, let me play with this and see how fast it can go. And, and basically we ended up having to throw those out because we would get, there was somebody whose tempo was like I think it was in like the 10,000 beats per minute kind of thing. And it was like, you're not actually doing the task. But we ended up addressing that by giving them time to play with it. And we told them, make it go as fast as you can, make it go as slow as you can, kind of got that wiggle out of their system, and then they did the task. So yeah, I mean, there were these different strategies. I don't think people were just going, because that's not the picture we get from the continuous data. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Always thought I'd ask. We have another non-remote question.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Very interesting. I was just wondering about the timbral associations here, because all the stimuli had a piano timbre,
Yes.
right? Okay. Do you think that might have influenced the results in any way, or constrained the range at least of, conceivable tempos?
It's possible. There have been studies that have found that a brighter timbre means that people want things to go faster. So that's something that we're planning on adding in. We want to add in more sort of sonic cues, articulation, timbre, that kind of thing, to sort of tease out the effect that has on it. What I can say is that for about 17 participants, there was a misfire in our sound, and they ended up getting this, instead of getting the piano sound that you heard, they got this weird, it sounded like a weird mistuned circus piano. And we isolated that data and we looked at it in comparison to the real piano sound, and there wasn't any difference between the two. We ended up not including that data just because we didn't want to have to explain that. But the weird circus piano timbre wasn't actually any different, and it was a significantly different timbre, and it was actually like mistuned also. It was really bizarre, and so at least that timbral difference didn't have any difference. But there has been research in the past that shows that brighter timbres do have an effect. So that is something that we're planning on investigating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The question won't be worth the build-up. No, anyway, so I was just curious whether there's any sense whether some of these changes that you encoded give rise to a sense of the meter, and whether that influenced either the rate at which people chose the tempo or what tempos they preferred to have. For instance, if you had contour changes that are spaced in a metrical way, or interval leaps, that kind of thing.
So there were a couple of melodies that were sequential. And those actually tended to be, if I remember correctly, those tended to be a little bit faster. So that's something that we're planning on looking at. In other words, even if you have a large skip or leap, if you have a pattern and you're expecting it, you can sort of deal with that large skip or leap better. But we tried really, really hard to avoid metrical cues. To the point where we included things like grace notes as the same duration as everything else. So these melodies were modified from the original. And so there are a couple where you kind of go, oh yeah, I'm kind of getting a hypermetrical structure here. But there was only like one or two of them that ultimately you could sort of identify that.
Sort of piggybacking off your response.
Yeah.
So if these features, these melodic features, maybe take more time for us to wrap our brains around that sort of end, would you consider maybe trying stimuli that were atonal or something completely out of the Western tradition, and see if maybe these were typically faster melodies, maybe we're catching on to them better, and then maybe the hypothesis would be that we need more time to focus on any melody or any sort of melodic material from something we're not familiar with, or would you consider something like that?
If I'm remembering correctly, sorry, the ITAN study from 2015-16 that I mentioned, I think they actually used quarter tones in their melodies. I'm not 100% sure of that. Don't quote me on it. But there was a melody, or there's a study I read recently where they did something with microtones, and they came up with the same results. That even if you jump from like a microtone to from one atonal situation to another, that the act of leaping, like our brain kind of has to catch up. It kind of has to slow down and go, whoa, where am I now? And that seems to be why we want things to go slower. So we haven't done it with atonal melodies, but that's obviously, you know, something that's important to do after we figure everything else out.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you know, in actual music performances from, you know, the standard canon, do things separate the way you're seeing, you know, based on the complexity of the melody, the performance tempos? I mean, you mentioned that sometimes musicians will perform something they don't know in the way that a listener would also choose the tempo, but yeah, so for real performances.
I think that's where Stacy and I need to get together because it would be really interesting to sort of run, you know, these ideas on her rhythmic or her stimuli and see if, you know, are there more contour changes, are there more skips and leaps in the ones that her performers tended to perform more slowly, and so on and so forth. And then to be able to do something like having her violin pieces and having people be able to pick what they think the optimal tempo is for those performances would, you know, we could essentially predict whether you know, how fast somebody would want something to go based on these characteristics. That's the ultimate goal. So the ultimate goal is creating some kind of a model where we can say, based on these characteristics of this piece, I think people are going to want it to go this fast or this slow.
Well, thanks, Lee, for a very interesting presentation. I'm curious to know if you've thought at all about how any of this might relate to the notion of tempo giusto, and if there might be cues inside some of these tunes that have stylistic information and implications that people carry with them with all that cultural baggage, and that's what makes them center in on certain tempi.
Yeah, that's actually, the ITAN study I mentioned actually also did things that were typically considered to be bass patterns versus things that were typically considered to be upper voice patterns. And they found that the things that were considered to be bass patterns, people did make them go more slowly. So yeah, I think there are certain sort of giveaway or tells for this is something that should go faster versus this is something that should go slower. And, you know, hopefully we'll be able to get at something like that.
Thank you, Lee. tempo judgment. Welcome, Rin.
Thank you for all for your patience. I'm going to go through a few basic definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. I'll go through these quickly because I know a lot of these are pretty basic for many of you. So talking about tactus, meter, and metrical hierarchy, when I say tactus, what I'm referring to are periodic beats or pulses, either present or implied in the music, to which most people entrain, and there's a citation from some famous guy. Meter, of course, is regularly occurring patterns of accents that emphasize these beats, and metrical hierarchy is the hierarchical pattern of strong and weak beats that create meter. Here is an example with which you might be familiar from Mozart's G minor symphony and a book by other famous people. And as you can see, the metrical hierarchy is demonstrated by the dot patterns at the bottom. So we have the pulse level at the top, and it gets incrementally stronger as we go down the hierarchy there. Important to this talk is the idea of the backbeat. And if you're not someone who listens to a lot of popular music, this might not be something that you're familiar with. So we'll go through a few examples. The backbeat is the emphasis on beats 2 and 4 in a measure of simple quadruple meter, more or less. We can argue about notation and recording and performance and stuff later. Typically, this is performed on the snare drum in popular music. Of course, if we expand our definition of popular music, this could be any other thing sort of standing for the snare drum. And this is very importantly a fundamental trait of popular music, and one that is used, or has at least been claimed to have been used as an orienting feature by musicians in a really wonderful paper by Robin Addis that she gave at SMT a few years ago. So here are a few examples of backbeat from very disparate genres of music, and I'll just sort of clap along to the backbeat, and you can enjoy the pictures. So here we go. I don't mind coming here. That is wasting all my time. 'Cause when you're standing oh so near, I kinda lose my mind. It's not the okay. Here's another example from a very different type of music. I had to throw in some Canadian content. I don't wanna die for them to miss me. Yes, I see the things that they wishing on me. Hope I got some brothers that outlive me. Okay, and another example just to show you again how sort of ubiquitous this really is. Okay, so a few other little definitions. When we refer to something called halftime feel, this is when the snare accent switches to beat 3, essentially, in consecutive measures. And sort of conversely, double time feel is when the snare accent doubles in speed. So here's another example that has a switch to a double time feel, so you'll see what I mean. I think you get the idea. So backbeat and its relationship to the metrical hierarchy is kind of contentious, I would say. So the dynamic accents that are created by the backbeat sort of contradict what we would assume to be the metrical hierarchy. And here's an example of what I mean. So in this really basic notation of a drum pattern, we've got a snare sort of represented on the third space there, and that's essentially being suppressed by the metrical hierarchy here. On the other, if we sort of tried to not suppress it, we could do something like this. But emphasizing the snare drum at the half measure level sort of breaks the well-formedness of Lerdahl and Jackendorf's theory that strong beats must be present at the next level of the metrical hierarchy. So how does the backbeat influence the metrical hierarchy? I would argue here that the consistent attacks on beat 3 are actually likely to be reinterpreted as beats 2 and 4, creating a halftime feel in this example. So something like this. Halftime and a double time, so I went a little quickly there, but as you can see, the beat 3 becomes beat 2 and 4 at a sort of twice as slow measure. And so what I'm saying is that halftime and double time effectively reorganize the metrical hierarchy, orienting measure level boundaries according to the location of the backbeat. So if the placement of the backbeat orients listeners' perception of the metrical hierarchy, then it's possible that backbeat placement could also impact tempo perception. Is it possible that style-specific parameters such as backbeat might have such an impact on our tempo perception? So there's lots of research, obviously, on tempo perception. We've heard a lot about lots of different kinds. I'll go through this relatively quickly. But we obviously can measure tempo perception very sort of precisely by just measuring inter-onset intervals. We can have people tap. We can of course, we know that there's no like perfect way to do this. Tapping can be problematic because we can have sort of kinematic or neurological problems with that. It sort of also ignores event density. Oh, I said that already. Okay. Another study by McKinney and Mullins showed that listeners actually attend to different metrical levels, and these levels can be influenced by musical style. One really interesting thing about their study that they mentioned is that their study showed, and then they did a study where people did these tempo judgments, and then they tried to sort of model it with a tempo extraction algorithm, and they showed that these algorithms often made what they call tempo octave errors. And this is exactly the halftime and double time feel thing that we're talking about. A study here by another famous guy, Justin London, showed that event density can in fact confound tempo judgments. And this was a study that kind of piqued my interest and pushed this study forward myself. So thank you very much. Another thing that kind of inspired this work is actually something from David Epstein's book, in which he sort of talks about tempo. It's speculating about tempo sort of kind of being more than the sum of its parts. In other words, if we sort of add up all of these factors together, we still aren't really capturing what the feel of tempo is. And so this was kind of something that I was really interested in thinking about halftime and double time feel specifically. So I'm not so interested in like the objective measurement of tempo so much as I'm interested in the idea of how fast music feels or how slow music feels, if that makes sense. So I did a couple of experiments. The first one basically investigated the impact of backbeat in a tempo comparison task. So participants compared the tempos of pairs of excerpts and identified whether the second excerpt of the pair was slower or the same tempo or faster than the first. So what I expected to happen from this, I expected that halftime and double time backbeat conditions would lower participants' accuracy in judging the tempo change between those two excerpts. In other words, they would make that judgment incorrectly according to an objective beats per minute measure. The halftime backbeat condition specifically would lead participants to hear the second excerpt as slower than the first, even if the second excerpt was actually faster in terms of BPM than the first. And the opposite of that as well. So if it was a double time backbeat condition, that would lead participants to hear the second excerpt as faster, even if it was in fact slower in terms of BPM. Okay, so we had some participants recruited from undergraduate classes, both music majors and non-music majors at the University of Lethbridge. About half of them were formally musically trained and the other half weren't. More importantly here, the material that I use here, so the stimuli were composed to convey the conventions of rock music. And I did this very deliberately because I think it's very, very important if we're talking about a stylistic impact and stylistic cues that people are sort of in the mindset that they're actually listening to this kind of music. So these were composed to convey the conventions of rock music and were played by a three-piece rock band including electric guitar, bass, and drum set. Each stimulus excerpt was 16 pulses in length, or about 4 measures or 2 measures, depending on if it was halftime or not. And each excerpt pair consisted of the same song, so they were never comparing different songs, but in fact the exact same thing, with 2 manipulations, either tempo, so the songs were either 120 or 132 BPM, and the backbeat. The backbeat could be either consistent, so exactly the same, half time or double time. This is a lot more clear when I'll demonstrate them in a second. So what they did for each trial, participants were asked whether the second excerpt of the pair was slower, the same, or faster than the first. And participants were asked, and this is very, very important because, again, I'm kind of after this, this idea of how fast it feels rather than something more objective. So participants were asked not to tap or otherwise engage physically with the music. Second one. Be asked to compare that second one to the first, whether it was slower, the same, or faster. Here's another example with a different canned rock example. So, relatively simple design. Hopefully that was clear enough. What we got in the results. So as predicted, the participants' accuracy in judging the tempo was significantly worse when the backbeat placement in the second excerpt created either a half or double time condition. In other words, if it wasn't consistent, then they were not as good at the task. And this was a significant, and there was obviously a significant change, significantly lower in the change condition. There's all the math there, but I'll just show a pretty picture instead. So you can see the no change was considerably higher, up over 80% accuracy. So we drilled down into these data a little bit further. There was also a significant difference between each of the three conditions broken down. So in the double time and the half time conditions were each actually significantly different from the consistent condition. So you can see that there. So we have both of those conditions. And further to that, the double time and the half time were significantly different from one another. And this is actually kind of interesting and what inspired another study that I'll talk about in just a second. So when the tempo was the same between the two, the accuracy was considerably lower between the two excerpts. And this is perhaps better explained here. As you can see, when the BPM was exactly the same, the accuracy was way, way worse. And you can also sort of see, although the experiment wasn't quite set up exactly to show that, but you can see that in the faster condition, you've got that exact effect that I was talking about. So when it's faster, but the second one is in a halftime backbeat, we have much worse accuracy, and then that situation is flipped when you have the opposite effect. So when the second excerpt is slower, but we get the faster backbeat, people are worse at this task. So I was really interested in the middle of this, and it was kind of perplexing to me when they were objectively the same, that they were so much worse at this. So I did a second experiment, and this experiment aimed to observe as closely as possible the effect of the backbeat by controlling for tempo variation. So in this experiment, I asked participants to compare the tempos of pairs of excerpts with the same tactus rate. Pairs of excerpts were always presented with different backbeats as well. I didn't do any of the same condition, only half time and double time. So in this example, there was never an example. They never actually had the second one as faster BPM than the first one, or vice versa. Okay, so my hypotheses for this study: the snare placement will affect the tempo judgments, and this will be reflected by the proportion of slower, faster responses being significantly different from chance. In other words, if these two are the same and the snare has no impact at all, then because we're forcing them to choose slower or faster, if there's no impact, it should just be 50-50. And vice versa, in the double time condition, the participants will judge the speed as faster than the first. And the proportion of faster responses will be significantly higher than chance. Lastly, in the half-time condition, participants will judge the second excerpt as slower. The proportion of slower responses will be significantly higher than chance. Oh, I think I said that already. Okay, sorry. So we had a few more participants in this time, same essential pool, majors and non-majors. 34 out of the 44 received some kind of musical training. And these were essentially the same stimuli, so I won't spend too much time talking about that. These were exactly the same, convey the conventions of rock music. They were 16 pulses in length, and excerpts were paired in each stimulus to create two backbeat conditions, just the half time and the double time. Okay. On each trial, importantly, participants were forced to choose whether the second of the pair was either slower or faster. There's no response of the same in this case. And participants, again, were asked not to tap or otherwise engage physically with the music. So the results, as we expected, the double time condition showed that there was a significant difference in terms of being faster than in the double time condition, people answered faster significantly more than chance. And the half time condition had exactly the same, or exactly the opposite. So half time people said slower more than faster. When we compared these two together, they were significantly different from one another. This is clearly demonstrated here in the graph more so than my talking. As you can see, in the faster condition, we have way more people answering, or in the double time condition, we have way more people answering faster, and in the half time condition, way more people answering slower. Okay, so what can we glean from this? Backbeat, I think, affects listeners' perception of tempo, and that we can say, I think, that listeners may attend to the backbeat when constructing their perceived metrical hierarchy. The tempo extraction algorithms that I was mentioning before may actually benefit from assigning backbeat some more weight in this case. And it's really interesting if you look at you can pull data from like Spotify or something like that, and they often get the tempo wrong, and it's exactly this problem where they don't sort of factor in where the backbeat is. Where might we go from here? Well, I think that this is a very sort of small start down this road. These experiments are sort of creating an unrealistic musical environment in a way, so that's kind of unfair. So I'd like to do a study that maybe avoids the direct comparison of a pair of excerpts. It would also be, although this time I was sort of interested in the feel very explicitly, it would be interesting to sort of compare this with a tapping study that used the same stimuli. And perhaps even further than that, some kind of non-behavioral paradigm where we're not asking people to make a choice at all. I would happily take questions. So thank you very much for listening. I don't know who is first.
I'll be pretty quick. There are just a few instances of songs like in rock music where the backbeat is like sort of shifted even further. I think of like Styx, Too Much Time on My Hands, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and right. And I was just thinking if that could potentially be another category to test. I know that they're pretty rare, but I think it would maybe balance out like the double time and half time feel, sort of like that shifting to that sort of
like a syncopated backbeat or something.
Exactly, like the very weakest. But it also makes me think maybe that's just a result of like a rhythmic distribution of labor too. You know what I mean? So I don't know if that would be something worth pursuing.
I definitely think so. I mean, this is pretty vanilla, and I'm looking at very, very sort of specific context. But I in a sort of earlier version of this project, when I hadn't done any experimental work, I was actually kind of doing it from a more of an analysis and a speculative point of view, and I found a whole bunch of examples of songs with weird backbeats, where you get things like the Police do this a lot, where they'll have a snare just on 4, and it sort of sounds like you're getting a halftime, but a halftime that's also shifted over by 2 beats, and it's this sort of really disorienting thing. Or for example, in that song by The Cars a little bit later on, I don't know if you know the song, but it switches the backbeat from 2 and 4 to 1 and 3, and it's this, you know, if you have musical training about this, you're like, that should be perfectly normal, but it honestly feels like a metrical dissonance to me. And I've always kind of, that's all the sort of stuff that sparked this research. So you're absolutely right. You know, there's a lot more variables here that I could dig into with further stuff. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Bryn. That was awesome. 2 comments / questions. The first one being, for me, I feel like when I go into a halftime or double time backbeat, my hierarchical perception of the tactus changes. Right? So when you ask me, well, is the tempo different? Yes, because the backbeat has changed, and therefore I hear this as maybe a faster tempo, right?
Yeah,
so,
that's the problem with the comparison task, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think your second question is definitely going toward that answer, but I don't know. Maybe you can design an experiment where you're actually testing like kind of the hierarchical change in your perception.
And I think that's going to require like a non-comparison task.
Yeah.
And this was just kind of like the easiest way into this question, but you're absolutely right, and I welcome any suggestions in a sort of response paradigm that might get at that a little better.
Yeah.
Because that's what I want to do next.
Right. The other just brief is, so maybe as trained musicians we identify that as 2 and 4, but then I'm wondering if maybe non-trained people might identify it as 1 and 3, or might not necessarily know where to place the metrical hierarchy.
I don't even know that they're counting at all, right? And I was asking them not to count. And I mean, I can't tell for sure if they were doing that, but I don't know. I really made explicit that we're talking about how fast it feels, right? And this is kind of another sort of application of this. I'm sort of interested in, way down the line, looking at kind of descriptive traits of music as being sort of like more laid back or more aggressive or whatever, and how that might relate to this kind of thing. I'm thinking specifically of something like reggae, right, which has a sort of halftime backbeat all the time, and people kind of associate reggae as like with this sort of like laid back kind of thing, or more contemporary examples. A lot of these like contemporary hip hop songs have this sort of halftime backbeat, and there's a kind of like sort of chill feeling with a lot of these kinds of things. And I mean, I haven't, this is just pure speculation at this point, but I haven't, I'm really curious to sort of compare that kind of thing to the results of this.
Yeah, thank you. So to piggyback on what she just said, another element that may be interesting is to look at kind of cultural associations. And so I thought of, and actually at the beginning of your talk, I thought of, do you remember back when President Obama was a candidate, and then there was that fantastic video of his preacher doing this musical example of like white people clapping to gospel music and black people, right?
Oh my God!
Yes, exactly. So
yeah.
I don't know if
that's not a path I had considered going down, but I mean, to be honest, when I collect these data, I've taken stuff about musical training and about background and that sort of thing, and I haven't really gone into that too much in sort of figuring this stuff out. But that's definitely something that I could do.
Thanks, Bryn. I think Stephanie is right. In my experience, when you ask people to rate tempo, they end up rating their own level of beat engagement, whether or not they're tapping. But I'll ask another question nonetheless. Is this also possibly an instance of the filled interval effect? So the double time just has more stuff happening during time?
Yeah, that's certainly something that I consider too, and I want to. Again, I kind of want to. This was like the simplest manipulation that I could have done for this study, but I want to kind of get at that. So see, there's just more sort of activity going on, and so more stuff equals faster. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's possible. I guess one way that I could maybe try to attack that would be to design a stimulus that has like a whole bunch of different layers going on, and then the sort of 2 and 4 or not was like not really a prominent feature as much. I don't know. I don't know quite how I would design that. It's very, very tricky, but that's something that I want to try to do anyway.
Thanks. This is really interesting stuff. I hear everything people have been saying about maybe the motivations for moving away from the forced choice to the tapping thing. I would
Mhm.
also just encourage you not to give up. Sorry, forced choice, and into doing tapping instead. I think the forced choice paradigm is actually pretty rich, and I hear what you're saying in terms of the way it sort of forces some awkward decisions. But you can actually use that if you build all the pairs systematically. In a way, it's more sensitive than the tapping.
Mm-hmm.
Other things with analyzing the tapping.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, the forced choice is actually cleaner. And if you look at this with some kind of like signal detection theory paradigm and looking at separating some of, I think because there's some biases in the responses one way or the other, then I think this could actually be a very powerful way of getting at the questions you're interested in.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll definitely. I would love to because I need to know more. Thank you. It's late. I'm sorry. Thank you all.
Go to dinner and drinking. Thank you all for sticking it out.
Thank you. Thank you.